Hello there, welcome to our first video on the evolution of birds and also how flight evolved in birds. So this is a really fascinating story, so I'm excited to share it with you over the next few videos. And first we'll focus on sort of what birds evolved from, who are the closest relative of birds. So birds are one of the main living groups of tetrapods. So if we ignore amphibians, the other tetrapods are divided into two big groups: synapsids, which include mammals, and diapsids, which is everything else basically. And so birds are diapsids, and they're actually the closest living relatives of crocodiles and alligators in a group called Archosauria. So that's right, alligators, surprisingly, are actually more closely related to birds than they are to lizards and snakes and things like that. So, obviously living birds and living alligators look quite different from each other. So we'll have to look at the fossil record to learn more about how birds evolved. So there's lots of fossil archosaurs, including crocodiles and their extinct relatives. So this group is in total called crocodylians sometimes. Dinosaurs are archosaur reptiles as well. And there's also pterosaurs, which is a separate group of extinct flying reptiles. So how are birds related to these groups? Where do birds fit into this evolutionary relationship? Well, we'll look at two different ideas, although I'm going to note up front that one of these hypotheses is very widely accepted, and the other hypothesis is promoted by just a few people. So one hypothesis proposes that birds are related to various archosaurs that might have branched off the evolutionary tree pretty early or pretty near the base of Archosauria. The other hypothesis proposes that birds are dinosaurs, just a group of dinosaurs that survived until today. So the Basal archosaur hypothesis argues that birds are related to a variety of small reptiles from the Triassic period, such as the ones shown here. And this one called Longisquama has been part of this discussion, I think in part because of these unusual filaments that project off of its back. Well, in recent years, this hypothesis has also argued that some species that are traditionally thought to be dinosaurs in the past are not actually really dinosaurs, but are in fact flightless birds. So we can draw this hypothesis as a phylogenetic tree on the right to show these proposed evolutionary relationships. And this is a very simplified phylogeny. I've left out a bunch of groups, but it shows that birds and a group called Archosauria and this animal on the left called Scansoriopteryx are the closest relatives of a group I've just labeled as Triassic reptiles. And that they actually aren't close relatives of dinosaurs, which are over on the other branch, ornithischians, sauropods, and the other theropods. So the other hypothesis proposes that birds are a group of theropod dinosaurs. This is sometimes phrased that birds evolved from theropod dinosaurs, but it's most accurate to say that birds and other theropods share a common ancestor. So we can represent this hypothesis with this phylogenetic tree on the left here, where birds and Archosauria are each other's closest relatives, and those two shared a common ancestor with Scansoriopteryx, and the group that includes those three is most closely related to other theropod dinosaurs, and so forth. So, how do we test these hypotheses? Well, rather than looking at any one feature, it's best to compare lots of different anatomical characteristics among lots of different species to see which of our two phylogenetic models, trees, is the best explanation. The idea behind this is if groups have a lot of features in common, they're more likely to be closely related, and if groups have very few features in common, they're perhaps not very closely related. So we can't do this for real in our class because it requires looking at hundreds of features, but we'll go through a few features just as an example of how this is done. So for example, let's start by looking at the anatomy of the hip bones. So is the acetabulum, which is the opening where the three hip bones meet, is it open or is it closed? And so we can mark this characteristic onto our phylogeny. So, for example, other theropods and sauropods and ornithischian dinosaurs and Archosauria and birds all have an open acetabulum. So I've marked them as open on the tree. Crocodylians and Triassic reptiles have a closed one, and it's partially closed in Scansoriopteryx. And so let's add this to the other phylogeny as well. So now we can look at how this feature might have changed during evolution. So it seems like if we look at the phylogeny on the left, that there was perhaps a shift from a closed to an open state here, sort of after Crotarsi diverged from this lineage, but before dinosaurs. Likewise, it appears that an open acetabulum would have evolved in the lineage leading to birds, perhaps with Scansoriopteryx having some kind of intermediate state. So let's add these changes onto the other phylogeny as well. Because Triassic reptiles and Crotarsi both have a closed acetabulum, we can infer that it was probably the original state here. So again, it would have sort of switched from closed to open at some point after Crotarsi diverged, but before Ornithischia diverged from the other dinosaurs. However, Scansoriopteryx has a partially closed acetabulum, so we might have to infer some kind of partial reversal here. So now, things evolving twice or things reversing are totally okay to have in phylogenies, but it does make it sort of more complicated and perhaps less likely. All right, well, let's look at another hip character, which is the presence or absence of a projection, which is sometimes called a boot, on the pubic bone, pubis bone there. So we can map the character states again onto our phylogenies, and the pubic boot is present in many other theropods, in Archosauria and in early birds, but not in other groups, including not in Scansoriopteryx. So what would you conclude about the evolution of this feature based on these trees? Well, in the phylogeny on the left, we would probably infer that it evolved twice. Once in our other theropods group, and then once somewhere, leading up to the common ancestor of Archosauria and birds. How about in the phylogeny on the right? What would you do for that? Well, we could do perhaps a couple things. We could say, well, maybe it evolved here somewhere before the common ancestor or around theropods, or we can say, and then maybe it was lost in Scansoriopteryx. Well, you could also propose that it evolved twice, like in the other one. So again, this is sort of kind of complicated in both scenarios. All right, how about some aspects of the spine? We can look at whether the sacrum, which is the part of the spine of the vertebrae around the hips, has just 2 vertebrae within it, or whether it has 3 or more. So it turns out that everything in our phylogeny, except for Crotarsi and the Triassic reptiles, have 3 or more sacral vertebrae. So in this case, what would you propose for the evolution of this feature? You can take a second to think about this and look at how you would place these changes on the tree. So I won't mark them this time, but the phylogeny on the left would need 2 evolutionary changes, but the one on the right only needs a single change, going from 2 to having 3 or more sacral vertebrae. Well, another feature we can look at is something called the glenoid fossa, which the name is not important, but it's basically kind of like a depression or sort of a small shape on where the arm meets the shoulder. So I've noted on the phylogeny whether this thing faces forwards, whether it's curved forwards, or whether it's curved backwards. And here the distribution of this character is the same as for the previous one, for our sacral vertebrae. So again, this would imply perhaps the same 2 evolutionary changes in the phylogeny on the left, but only 1 on the phylogeny on the right. So again, maybe our phylogeny on the right is somewhat simpler and perhaps a more likely explanation. So how about the presence of a wishbone, which is technically called a furculum? So there's a furculum in other theropods, in Scansoriopteryx, in Archosauria, and in birds. If you've ever eaten turkey, you maybe have seen the wishbone, but not in other groups. So again, see if you can mark on each phylogeny where this character perhaps would have evolved. So like before, the phylogeny on the left appears to require 2 separate developments of the wishbone, where it could be explained by a single origin in the phylogeny on the right. Well, finally, we'll look at the presence of a semi-lunate, or sort of half-moon-shaped, wrist bone or carpal bone in the wrist. So the wrist bone has this shape in Scansoriopteryx, Archosauria, and birds, but not in any of the other groups. So how would you describe the evolutionary history of this feature on each phylogeny? Well, in this case, they're both pretty similar. They would both have a single origin at kind of the same point, at the evolution just before the common ancestor of Scansoriopteryx Dinosaurs, and birds. So obviously I've chosen just a few features for this example here, but if you think about just the 6 characters we looked at in the video, which phylogenetic hypothesis do you think is the more likely one? The one on the left, with birds evolving from early archosaurs, or the one on the right, with birds evolving from theropod dinosaurs? Well, as I said, these phylogenetic analyses are typically done with hundreds of characteristics, not with 6. But when they're done, they consistently place birds within theropod dinosaurs and within dinosaurs as a whole. So here's something called a super tree, which shows proposed evolutionary relationships among a few hundred dinosaur species, and it includes birds as one group within theropods. So the evidence is quite strong that birds are best placed as a type of theropod dinosaur. And that's the hypothesis that's accepted by nearly everyone, although not by everyone. So why is it questioned by some people? Well, one argument has been that most of the fossils used to argue that birds are theropods are actually younger, from the Cretaceous period, than the earliest fossil birds, which are from the Jurassic period. And this is partly true, in that many of the species from the sister group, the closest relative, are indeed from the Cretaceous period. But some are from the Jurassic period. The Troodontidae goes back to the Jurassic period. And so these ghost ranges, these thin dotted red lines here, which are the time between the oldest known fossil in the black bars and the expected divergence age of the group. So these ghost ranges are not particularly large or unusual. There's always ghost ranges. You can see some within birds where an earlier evolutionary lineage doesn't actually appear as a fossil until sometimes much later than other ones. So the reason that these things are not particularly unusual is that we only know of a small fraction of all dinosaurs that actually ever lived. And so therefore it's not surprising to have gaps where we're missing fossils. If we had more fossils, we would find more things related to these. We might be able to have fossils extending backwards. This is also made worse because some time periods, such as the Jurassic, just have fewer fossils overall, and so we don't see a lot of these groups until the Cretaceous. So the second argument that's been sometimes made is that theropod dinosaurs were larger animals that lived on the ground and ran around on the ground. And the supporters of the Basal or early archosaur hypothesis assume that flying birds should have evolved from tree-dwelling and gliding ancestors. Yeah, well, that may be true, and we'll discuss that more in a later video, but it's not really good scientific practice to fit the evidence to what you think should have happened, rather than looking at what the evidence says and interpreting things from there. So to end, I just want to return to the idea that the existence of dinosaurs after birds evolved somehow means that birds couldn't have evolved from dinosaurs, or couldn't have shared a common ancestor with other theropods. Well, that argument seems to be based, I suppose, on a viewpoint that evolution is kind of progressing towards some kind of goal, right? That once birds evolve, birds are the things we're trying to get, and so everything else kind of just disappears. But birds were just one group of theropod dinosaurs in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, and all of these groups kept evolving, or many of these groups kept evolving new species, even after birds diverged and had evolved. There's no reason to expect other theropods to stop evolving and just disappear when birds appear. In fact, many of these theropod groups continued throughout the entire Cretaceous period. It just happens that birds were actually the only theropods, or the only dinosaurs at all, to survive the mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period. So they're the only dinosaurs we have left today. Well, that's all for now, so thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.